Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're broadcasting on Channel 9 and also on WJOPLP Newburyport FM 96.3, as well as streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome today's guest. Professor Paul Slovic is here. His work helped me understand aspects of America's response to the pandemic that it just baffled me from its very beginning last year. And I think and I hope that it may help you understand our country's response or non response to the pandemic as well. So, Professor Paul Slovic of the University of Oregon studies judgment and decision making with an emphasis on decision making under conditions of risk. His work examines fundamental issues such as the influence of emotion on judgments and decisions. His most recent research examines psychological factors contributing to apathy toward genocide, politicized violence, and decision making pertaining to nuclear war. Professor Slovic, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to visit the morning show. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mary. I'm glad to be here.
My pleasure, entirely. Well, let's dig in. As I mentioned, your research first came to my attention in an article in the Washington Post that was titled, Why Americans Are Numb to the Staggering Coronavirus Death Toll. And this is something, as I mentioned, that I've just found puzzling from the very beginning of the pandemic. It seemed as though the more the number of deaths climbed higher on all those dashboards we were seeing on the evening news, the more obstinately it seemed like people were resisting the idea that there was any danger at all. It felt to me as though for some people, the pandemic felt like some kind of apocalyptic video game, ungrounded in real world suffering and grief. So I was relieved in your research to find some answers to this otherwise baffling indifference, seeming indifference. But before we apply your research findings to the pandemic, I'd like to trace your interest in this topic back to 1994, when I've read that you were disturbed by the indifference of the American public to the genocide in Rwanda. Some 800,000 people were murdered in about 100 days. And around the world, including in America, pretty much nobody did anything in response. So please tell us how the events in Rwanda prompted you to launch this line of research.
Yes, was quite a shocking revelation that people around the world knew of what was going on. In fact, there was a UN general in Rwanda, Romeo Dallaire, who was down there with a small peacekeeping force to keep the Hutus and the Tutsis, calm while a peace treaty was being negotiated. And he was tipped off as to what was going to happen. And he was shown the cache of arms, that were being prepared by the Hutus to assault the Tutsi peoples. And he immediately reported this to his superiors at the UN and also to the Clinton administration. And neither of them were allowed him to intervene. He said, let me stop this now before it starts. I can stop this. But they said, no, you're just an observer. You're not allowed to intervene. And then the genocide began, and the killing was vast. And he again reported back what was happening, and they still said, no, you're not. You're just an observer. And that's the way it went. And as you say, 100,000, about 800,000 people died in about 100 days. And so I started thinking about that in light of other psychological research that I was familiar with, particularly the work by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who produced a paper in the late 1970s called Prospect Theory that had a curve, a figure showing how we value things as their numbers increase. Mm-hmm. And what that figure showed is that we start out, the very first unit of something, the first dollar, the first life is important, mm-hmm. but the second doesn't seem twice as important. Mm. As the numbers increase, the increases don't seem to matter as much. Yeah. And I thought, well, this is a form of insensitivity that reflects what I would call psychic numbing that seems to be at work here. This is why, when we value individual lives greatly, but that when they get to large numbers of lives, then they just become numbers, and they don't create emotion in us, and we need emotion to motivate us to do something.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's emotion that draws us to want to act. And so, thank you for that description of Rwanda. When I was reading your background, it reminded me of how shocking it was afterwards to realize how much indifference had been deployed at such a horrible, horrible, massive amount of death. Well, Paul, please tell me then, in response to that, what are some of the kinds of experiments that you launched to delve further into this phenomenon of psychic or statistical numbing, and whether you were surprised or not what you discovered with the experiments?
Right. Well, of course, it's difficult to do experiments on genocide. You really can't do that.
Yeah,
So you have to sort of
yeah,
simulate this
yeah, absolutely.
in survey or studies. Um, and one of the first studies that I did with some colleagues was based on the Rwandan genocide, because those who survived the genocide fled, and many of them ended up in a refugee camp on the
Mhm.
border between Rwanda and what was then Zaire, and a large camp. And what I and we were what I saw in the newspaper, a local newspaper, I saw a story saying that people in that camp were beginning to die from cholera because they lacked
Mm.
clean water. And I said, well, this could be the kind of the scenario that we could use in a study. So we asked people, and we brought people in to be our participants in the study, and we said, supposing you're an official in a neighboring country, and you see that people are dying from cholera in a refugee camp, and you'd like to help, and you have enough money to provide drilling equipment that could drill new wells and provide clean, safe water to 4,500 people in the camp. But you've got other things you could use your money for. You could improve your schools, your hospitals, your roads in your own country with that money. So you have a choice. Which would you do? Would you use the money domestically, or would you use it to try to keep 4,500 people healthy in the refugee camp? That was their choice. And then the experiment was that we manipulated one small thing, and we had half the people in one condition, half the people in a second. And the difference was that in one group saw that was told that there were 11,000 people in the camp. You could keep 4,500 people alive. The second group was told there are 250,000 people in the camp. You can keep 4,500 alive. Would you do it? And we found that people were far more willing to spend their money and keep 4,500 people alive in the small camp than in the
Interesting.
large camp. And this fit exactly the theory that Kahneman and Tversky had put forth, which, by the way, won the Nobel Prize for Kahneman in the year 2002.
Mhm.
Anyway, what it shows is that people responded to kind of to the proportion of people
Yeah.
that are being helped rather than the number. And so you see that if you have 11,000 people at risk, and you could cut it down to 55 to 6,500, you're like cutting it in half. That seems good. If you're going from 250,000 to 245,500, or that doesn't seem like anything, because it's on the
Yeah.
flat part of the curve. That fits exactly their theory. And so that was the first step. And then with other colleagues, I always work with other colleagues. They're very, valuable. They have good ideas, and they do much of the work. I don't get the credit, but it's other people that do this work. So anyway, we started to do more studies. And we turned to studies of asking people to donate money to people who are in distress, like children who are starving in various places.
Yeah.
And then we would manipulate parts of the scenario or the information they were given to see how it would affect whether they would donate uh, to these needy causes. And we found that if we had an individual person, say a child who was facing starvation, as the representative of the need, we would get a fairly strong response in
Mhm.
donations. But if there were many children or people in need, we got often a lesser response. And we found that it made a difference even if there was two children rather than one. You know, that it's not that people wouldn't donate to the cause when they saw two children representing that cause, but it wasn't twice as much. It was
Yeah.
less than twice as much. And then sometimes we found that it was less than even with one child. And you know, that was really, again, disturbing that kind of the compassion and empathy that drives us to respond uh, begins to crack at the number two, you
Right.
know,
It's a
and
dramatic fall off.
right. And of course, you know, if we start to lose it at two, well, no wonder, you know, when there are larger numbers, you know,
That's right.
thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions,
Right.
you know,
Right.
we're not responding.
Right.
And again, this represents uh, two things that we identified in these studies. And one is called the singularity effect.
Hmm.
That's the high value we put on an individual life.
Hmm.
And you know, the difference between no one at risk and one person is huge. And I
Yeah.
started collecting articles from the local newspaper, depicting situations where an individual was in danger and someone else risked their life to save this person.
Yeah.
You know, a single life is immensely valuable and will do a lot to rescue or protect that life. But then as the numbers increase, we we don't respond proportionally more. And so the reverence for the individual life we call the singularity effect,
Hmm.
and then the insensitivity to large numbers of lives we label as psychic numbing.
Hmm.
And this is and these factors are the beginning of a broader concept that envelops our work, which we call the arithmetic of compassion.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this arithmetic is a flawed arithmetic. It's a deadly arithmetic because
Yeah.
it reflects the fact that the more who die, the less we care. That's
Right.
not a proper arithmetic.
That's right. Right. And it incapacitates us from being able to be effective then in drawing on our compassion to take care of the larger problem and the greater number of deaths. Paul, were you surprised as you began engaging in this research? Um, how did you respond emotionally? Were you surprised at it? Or did you kind of go, oh, that makes sense. I get it now. What effect did it have on you as a person to be making this discoveries?
Well, I wasn't surprised because um, for all of my research career, I've been studying kind of ways in which the human mind does things that are, you know, are strange and surprising and unexpected and often
Yeah.
non-rational. We call these, biases in the way we think. You
Yeah.
know that, and failures to to uh, to do to make judgments and decisions that could be called
Yeah.
rational. So this is just another in this long string of biases that we've been and other with other colleagues we've been identifying. So that didn't surprise me.
Yeah.
In terms of how it makes me feel, well, it worries me,
Hmm.
uh, and it it connects to what we see happening in the world, where we see that there are many important problems that affect large numbers of people
Yeah.
that are being that we don't react properly to. You know
Yeah.
that we tolerate various forms of danger and injustice to large numbers of people that we should be outraged against and
Yeah.
railing against and fighting against, and we just sort of let it happen. You know, and this is whether it's genocide, which has occurred repeatedly after the Holocaust, when
Yeah.
we said never again, but it's again and again.
Right.
There's always been genocides and other mass atrocities happening, and they're happening as we speak around the world,
Yeah.
and the world isn't paying much attention to this
Yeah.
and trying to stop them. I mean, it's genocide, but it's also problems of disease,
Yeah.
or food insufficiency, other problems, racial injustice, a lot of things that happen that harm large numbers of people that
Yeah.
we tolerate.
Yeah. Well, Paul, one of the lenses that your work applies to these problematic and worrisome issues, some of which you just identified, are I was struck in reading one of your articles when you pointed out this isn't because there are bad people. And I think that's really critical to being able to understand and approach this problem, unpack it, and then do something about it. It's a psychological tendency that we all have. And to me, that's a hopeful thing to say. It's not because we're bad people. Because when people feel like they're bad, I think they go to a place of shame, and then it gets much harder to engage them in understanding what can be done to address the problem. So thank you for your research. I think it's a real strength of your research that you help us make sense out of the psychological tendencies that we're bringing to bear that ill-equip us sometimes to deal with the more massive the problem, the larger the number of deaths, sometimes the more, well, to use your expression, we go psychically numb. Or another phrase that I came across in your work was compassion fatigue, compassion collapse, I think. Um, Now, one of the factors, in addition to compassion collapse and psychic numbing, you've referenced Daniel Kahneman's work, and many people may remember he had a best-selling book called Thinking Fast and Slow that came out a few years ago. And you reference his work as you did when you were just talking. And I know in your writing, I've read about the impact that thinking fast and slow has on psychic numbing. It's a function of the brain. So could you talk a little bit about what that means? What is slow thinking and what is fast thinking? And why did one of them come online evolutionarily before the other?
Very, very good question. So, so fast thinking is what we usually do. It's kind of going with our intuition, with our gut feelings, and having those kind of be our compass that guides us through our day. We make a lot of decisions during the day, and we're not calculating, do kind of complex analysis and relying on data and things. We just kind of do things that we've learned work for us or that feel right, and usually that turns out good. I mean, we do it because it's easy, it feels right, and it usually
Yeah.
works for us, except when it doesn't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and one of the ways that fast thinking, relying on feelings, doesn't work is because we've learned that our feelings can't count. Our feelings are innumerate, and that's
Yes.
refers to that arithmetic of compassion that
Yes.
I meant. So
Yeah.
that our feelings, are strongly engaged by one person or a couple of people, particularly if we see pictures of them, or we know them, or we hear their story. We can get emotionally connected to them, and then we're motivated to help them
Yeah.
if they need help. That's the way the feelings work, and and that is in contrast to through evolution. We also our brain evolved to be able to do some things that are more complex, more abstract, what Kahneman calls slow thinking.
Yeah.
We and this is what we teach children in school to do. You're supposed to think logically, use good arguments, do calculations, and collect. We should collect data and evidence. That's slow thinking. So we can do both of those kinds of thinking, with our modern brains. The problem is that slow thinking is hard work, and as Kahneman points out, the human brain is lazy, and if we think we can do the job with our quick gut impression, we go that way, and
Yeah.
and we don't do the slow thinking. So when we lived in caves, we didn't have to do the slow thinking. And we didn't have to worry about large numbers of people far away and what was happening to them. It wasn't
Right.
part of our world. We only had to take care of ourselves, our family, a few people in our community. That's what mattered. And so we people survived who were good at that, and our brains evolved at that, and those brains responded strongly to small numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes just one. As you point out, one of the images that I came across in your reading that really stuck with me was at one point you make the comment that having empathy for someone is like putting yourself in their shoes. But what if there are two people? And it makes you think about, yeah, try putting 2 feet in four shoes. And
Right.
it just brought it home, the challenge there, and what you've described as the problem with the psychic numbing begins even when we go from one to two. Um, so and so Paul, the other major obstacle that you talk about in addition to psychic numbing is hopelessness. And I was hoping that you might describe how hopelessness becomes a danger in addressing large problems or massive deaths or genocides, and how this problem of hopelessness, you mean it in a particular way because you're talking about it as rooted in the biology, really, of what makes us feel hopeful, or biologically, what makes us not feel, what makes us feel hopeless. So I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about that.
Well, this too relates to sort of a peculiarity of how our feelings influence us. So, so when we have an opportunity to help someone, we help others because first they need help. Second, we feel good about doing it. So economists have coined the term kind of a warm glow. We get a warm glow of
Yes.
satisfaction for helping others. And what we learned in these experiments we were doing on psychic numbing was that um, in some cases, when if we turned people's attention to the fact that they could help someone, but unfortunately there were others they couldn't help, they didn't help as much, even though they could. So
Hmm.
one example, one experiment that we did was again giving people the opportunity to donate money uh, to a charity on behalf of children who were starving, and we showed a picture of one child uh, facing starvation with a name and an age and a picture, and a certain percentage of people donated to the cause. Then we thought we could increase the donations by uh, emphasizing that this child was part of a bigger problem, that starvation was a really big problem in her the region where she lived. And so next to her picture, we put the statistics of the fact that there were millions of other children starving in this region. And we thought, oh, people will say, oh, this is really a big problem. I mean, and donate more. And it went the other way. The donations dropped in half when you put those numbers there. And
Interesting.
we what we then surmised was, well, um, it didn't feel as good to help this child when there were so many. It was like what you would say is a drop in the bucket, you know,
Yeah.
and so that people then didn't even help the child they could help. And
Yeah.
we gave this a weird name. We called it pseudo inefficacy. Pseudo because you really are effective, but you feel that you're not, and so you don't do what you can
Yeah.
do.
Pseudo inefficacy. Well,
That's
that's a
a,
great
a
phrase.
mouthful.
That's a great phrase. And it
So
really
that's
does sum it up. And it's painfully ironic, isn't it? Because the more the need, the more hopeless one feels and the less one donates. But you're still having a positive impact. Whether you're donating $50 to help 50 kids, even if there are 100,000 other kids, those first 50 kids still need the money. You're still being,
that's right.
that's, I guess, non pseudo efficacy. That's
Yes,
really interesting, and gives a measure of what we're up against with some of the psychological tendencies that you've outlined.
it's
Well,
another pillar of what we call the flawed or deadly arithmetic of compassion.
yes, that's
That
right. Right.
it's irrelevant information. And what we also learned from that was that our feelings, that our brain uh, has no gatekeeper against information that carries emotion. That is things that come to our attention that are emotional. the brain lets in all these feelings, whether they're relevant or not.
Yeah.
Uh, and whereas if someone gives you an argument as to why you
Mhm.
should do something, you may think of a counter argument. But
Right.
if information comes in bearing some good or bad feeling, you don't think of counter feelings. It doesn't happen.
Right.
And
That's
this
right.
again is evolutionarily adaptive. If you heard a noise in the bush that sounded ominous, threatening, you
Yeah.
didn't stop to make, to vet, what could it be, this or that, and maybe it's
Right.
not that. You just got out of there. You
Right.
accepted it and got out of there. And our brain still does that today. And you know, in a different direction from what we've been talking about. This is one of the reasons that fake information that carries feelings gets in and influences us, even if it's logically preposterous. The
Right.
feelings come in and mess us up.
That's right. They come in and they take over. Wow, that's really fascinating, Paul. I wanted to return a little bit to some of the particular circumstances around the pandemic as we've been experiencing it and not reacting proportionately to it. I wonder what your thoughts are about the psychological impact of the particular way that death has unfolded in hospitals or away from anybody pretty much offering witness to it. Even families don't get to go say goodbye in person. They have to sometimes say goodbye through an iPad. So the images that we are exposed to feel very depersonalized. Of the hospital workers, we might see in images on TV are gowned in masks. They look like moonwalkers, and the bodies, to the extent we see them, are encased in zipped up bags. We do get some accounts, often written accounts from frontline workers, and they describe dying from COVID as a horrible experience, kind of like drowning above the water, but we don't ever really see it. And I've often thought, in contrast to that, about images I remember from the Vietnam War. There was a famous photo. I'm sure everybody who is old enough to remember the Vietnam War will remember the photo of the little girl running toward the camera in sheer terror. She's
Mhm.
looking right at the camera and right at you. And it really registered the horror of war on the psyche because it was an individual little girl.
Right, right.
It wasn't statistical. Uh, so, Paul, you study how people perceive risk and make decisions about it. What do you think are the factors that are impacting with the pandemic right now, how people are evaluating the risks and rewards of behaviors such as mask wearing, for example, or going to parties and bars?
Yes, well, the images are very powerful because they play on our feelings, and the feelings are the representation of risk. But actually, the reactions to the pandemic, there's really complex. There's a number of psychological factors in addition to numbing that are relevant. So sure, I think we've become numb to the statistics that we see every day. Now it's 387,000 deaths, or now it's 389. Again, those are numbers, and
Yeah,
we're not sensitive to those. We know it's bad, but we're not sensitive. But so why aren't we acting? So right from the start, a different psychological factor came in and challenged us and allowed the pandemic to get out of control, and that is the fact that the virus, COVID virus, spreads exponentially. What does that mean? It means that if every person who's infected infects more than one other person, and that each of those people infect more than one other, then you start an exponential spiral
yeah,
where things rapidly get out of hand, and they look safe at the beginning. It goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8, no big deal. 16. Well, our president said, "Oh, there's only 15 cases now in the country, no
right,
problem." But then those 15 double and double and
right.
double,
It
and
just,
very
right,
quickly you've got thousands.
right.
And people, um, our brain doesn't anticipate that. We
Hmm.
project in a straight line from
Hmm.
the small number and think that down the road it's still going to be fairly small, when in
Hmm.
fact by that time it's exploded and is out of control.
Yeah.
So there are people who understand that. The public health people, the epidemiologists, they know that. They were warning us, but
Yeah.
we weren't taking that seriously because
Right.
we just saw, there's still not many
Right.
cases. And the time to cut that off and stop it is early.
Yeah.
Exponential growth, the way you get it is you nip it in the bud before it can explode.
Right.
And we didn't do that. We were
No, we
slow.
sure didn't.
Around the world,
Yeah.
people were slow.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the numbers get big and we get desensitized to them. But another factor that is really a problem is what we would call the reinforcement principles of when we do that, when we're told to wear masks and socially distance and stay away from bars and restaurants and the workplace. Um, at first we do this,
Yeah.
because we know that this is a bad thing, and so we do this. But then it goes on and on and on, and we don't feel a positive reinforcement for doing that. That is, we don't get rewarded for doing these things. We get punished. That you don't see the people that you're being protected from, or
Right.
you're protecting, when you wear a mask or you socially distance. But you feel the cost. You can't do things
Right.
you want to do. You can't
Right.
hang out with your friends or go to restaurants or the
Yeah.
workplace. So
Yeah.
you don't feel a reward, and you feel an immediate punishment for doing the right thing. And and then the opposite, when you do the wrong thing, when you violate this, you feel an immediate benefit getting to do all these
Right.
things, and you don't see the cost. The cost is latent. It's invisible till, and you may not and never see the people, that get
Right.
harmed when many people violate this. I mean, there's statistics. You don't. So with that kind of reverse backwards reinforcement, you can't maintain that behavior. You can't expect people to keep doing it,
Right.
week after week after month
Right.
after month, unless you put in external rewards and punishments.
Right.
That is, you have to have have uh, maybe fines or other kind of
Yeah.
enforcement of it if people violate the guidelines. And you also have to reward people, give people rewards for doing the right thing. Like
Right.
when they are economically struggling, government has to come in and help them survive until they can go back to work and do things. So,
Right.
you have to have external rewards and
Right.
punishments, because the rewards and
Right.
punishments we're getting are backwards.
Right. Right. That makes perfect. That's so logical.
Yeah.
It's perfectly logical as you explain it. The rewards need to be as tangible as the costs. Otherwise, it's just we're just kind of like it's all just too murky. Well, Paul, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about social media because people rely on that for way too much information, I think. And social media relies upon fast thinking, it seems. I've read about how the algorithms that are employed for social media are very much attuned to emotional words. Because what the algorithms are looking for is not slow thinking, it's clicks.
Yeah.
Because it's the number of clicks that will generate more profits for the companies that are hosting the social media sites. And so it seems like our fast thinking is constantly being prompted and rewarded with social media. And we have so many big problems in the world today. We've been talking about many of them, not just the pandemic, but climate change, misinformation. Um, so I'm curious to find out, given that environment, about how information spreads now largely through social media. What are your thoughts about how do we get slow thinking to catch up with the fast thinking that surrounds us in the social media world so that slow thinking can help us be better informed and make better decisions? That's a big question, I know.
I'm
But you're just
smiling
the person to address it.
because it is a good question, but there's no simple answer. I mean, just to back up with regard to the fast thinking that we talked about, that enables genocides and other
Yeah,
horrible things to occur in the world and not be confronted. Um, and also the sense of inefficacy, that I'm
yeah,
just one person. What can I do? The problem is big, and I'm
yeah,
just one person, what can I do? So I think there's two things that we can do there. One is, first we have to be aware of the fact that we can, that our minds can be deceived,
Yeah.
and we tend to underreact to the big problems uh, because they don't create the kind of emotional connection that the small problems do. So first we have to be aware of it. Second, I think the way to overcome the inefficacy is to join forces with people who have done the slow thinking and know the seriousness of the problem and are dedicating their lives, their careers to confronting and dealing with these problems. Join up, if it's an organization, send them money and join the organization. Go to work for them if you can. Link up with people whose slow thinking is working to make these problems better. Now, um, now there was another part to your question in terms of the slow thinking with regard to
Well, just in regard to social media, for one
social
thing,
media. Okay, I forgot the
and
social media.
yeah,
Right. Okay. So social media, again, it's words carry emotion,
yeah,
and that's a large part of the meaning of a word is the feeling that it creates in you, which is good or bad. If I say the word joy, you get a immediate positive sense.
yeah.
If I say the word hate, you sense negativity instantaneously. So words are powerful and emotional. And what also we've learned from psychological research, and we recognize it in ourselves, is that the negative is stronger than the positive. There's a famous psychological article called "Bad is Stronger Than Good."
Yeah.
And so negative information has more impact and motivates us more than positive. This is why now, and the political advertisers know this well. That's why the ads are all negative,
Yeah.
predominantly negative. And social media is filled with negativity, which I think is very harmful. We've seen in the recent week or two, the harm that mobilization of people who are aggrieved or hateful through social media, how powerful that is. So that's a big problem. I think we have to address it in the future. It's, I mean, we've taken a step by taking our president's Twitter feed away.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more that needs to be done, and
Yeah.
that's a bigger problem than I could. There's other people better able to work on that. But I think we need to work on that and deal with it. Absolutely.
I think that it's been interesting. There's been I read an article that it's been in the news that with the banning of Trump's Twitter feed, the amount of misinformation went down dramatically
Right.
on social media. Now, and these are interesting, slow thinking points, aren't they? For us to observe and notice and learn from and go, what do we make of that? What do we want to do with that to help us create a better society? But I think that basically you are making with your research a huge contribution to advancing the cause of slow thinking, because the implication of what you're saying is that our biggest strength is self-awareness, which is a slow thinking.
Right.
But if we can apply the self-awareness that you're helping us understand better, and again, I think it's a huge contribution to frame it, not in terms of blame or shame or anything like that, but just we need to know how our brains evolved, and we need to understand we have these different modes of perceiving. And one of them, the fast thinking, makes us vulnerable to misperceptions and to not being able to take action on massive problems that harm us all. So Paul, thank you. I think that your work is fascinating, and I think it's a huge step in the direction of helping people better understand how our minds work, and why we sometimes fail to do things to address in an appropriate way something like the genocide in Rwanda. So self-awareness to me seems like the underlying key. And I would like to know, I know you have a relatively new, you've written lots of articles about this, And you have a new book, though, called Numbers and Nerves. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your latest book, Numbers and Nerves. It's a collection, I think, of different
Right,
essays by
right,
artists and writers in
right,
all kinds of areas.
right. I can show you a picture of it.
There you go, Numbers
the,
and
the
Nerves.
the cover has it looks so red. It's hundreds of thousands of roses in one to
Oh,
simulate the British war dead in the World War
oh, like
One.
the
The
poppies.
individual flowers
Yeah,
to represent that. And the book is written with my son Scott,
I
who's
wondered. I noticed the
field
last
is
name.
literature and environment. He thought he was in a different, going into a different field than I was, but our interest merged. And so, again, the book is an attempt to make people aware of the arithmetic of compassion, and it has a number of essays, both not only by psychologists, but by people like journalists who have recognized the importance of telling individual stories as opposed to statistics. And
Yeah,
it has a chapter about several chapters about artists or people who get produce displays to represent large numbers of people at risk or who have died through individual images. One is photographer Chris Jordan, who produces art pieces, and when you hone in on this, you see that they're made up of individual things like
oh,
hundreds of thousands of plastic cups, which he then
oh,
says, oh, this is the number of plastic cups used by the airlines every 4 hours. This is when the airlines
wow,
were
okay,
busier. So it's a way of appreciating quantity through
yeah,
image. So
yeah,
the whole purpose of the book is to try to sensitize us to different ways to appreciate large numbers and to understand the meaning of things that are happening
yeah,
in the large scale. And then
yeah,
we followed the book by creating a website called
yeah,
arithmeticofcompassion.org, one word, arithmeticofcompassion.org,
hmm,
which further builds on the psychological research, but then has blogs that show how the pillars of this flawed arithmetic are playing out in what is happening around us in today's
yeah,
world.
yeah,
So that's what we've been trying to do.
yeah. And I would encourage anybody to take a look. There are many wonders at the Arithmetic of Compassion website, including a take action page.
Yes,
So, Paul, once again, thank you at so many levels. Thank you for taking the time to come and visit the morning show and teach us more about your important work. And thank you for the research that you've done and the insights that you have shed upon our psychological tendencies and mapping out a hopeful road for how we can. This sounds counter to American values, but how we can slow down our thinking and,
yeah,
and develop our compassion and increase our effectiveness and stay hopeful. So thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate your taking the time to visit today's show. That's it for today's show, everybody. I hope you'll join us next Thursday morning at 9 for the morning show. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon and then look for the playlist for the morning show with Mary Jacobsen. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and the following Tuesday at 4 and Wednesday at 3, and will be available as well as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org and click on the cloud icon and scroll down. Thank you so much, Paul. Take care, everybody. See you next week.
thank you.